I think a lot about kinesthetically, the physicality of playing an instrument. Like when I'm writing saxophone, I think about what it feels like to play these, so I think a lot about that from a perspective of I don't want to make it unreasonably overly challenging for no apparent reason for the player.
Hello, and welcome to episode 46 of the BandWagon podcast for the week of January 27th, 2025. On this edition of the program, news and notes from the band world, including a news item about a band director that may not be about that band director, a wee podcasting confession from a wee podcaster, a follow-up to last week's First Strain rant, and I have my first BandWagon conversation with a band composer. I'm your host, Rob Hamilton. Hello, dear listener. Something for everyone in this episode, I think. Intrigue, confessions. Gee, you'd think it was a mystery novel. Famously, I can't write those, but I can write podcast copy. So here it comes. Alphabetize your music folder, but not by the word the. And away we go. Let's play the first strain. In this episode's first strain, news and notes from the band world. Dateline, Nashville, Tennessee. Credit to the reporting of Rachel Wegner of the online publication The Nashville Tennessean. Tennessee State University has removed Reginald McDonald, the director of its Grammy-winning marching band, and placed him on paid administrative leave as that HBCU school's leaders carry out an investigation. For 23 years, McDonald has held various leadership roles with the band, known as the aristocrat of bands, and has served as its director since 2015. In a news release, TCSU's interim president, Dwayne Tucker, announced, quote, "This decision concerns outstanding travel requisitions and advances and related lack of compliance with TSU policies and procedures. Dr. McDonald will be on administrative leave with full pay while we continue this investigation." Tucker's press release continued saying, quote, "As this is an ongoing personnel matter, I will not be able to comment further about it at this time. What I can say is that this difficult decision, and any that come here forward," by which I think he meant any decisions, "have at their core a shared commitment to ensuring a bright and stable future for Tennessee State University." The decision to remove McDonald from his position, place him on leave, and investigate came after an internal audit. Tucker served on the Tennessee State University board from April through December, which was when he was named president of the university. Reportedly, Tucker then quickly got to work with the board's audit committee as the university has faced dire financial straits after a year of major leadership upheavals. Stick a pin in that. Last year, Tennessee Republican lawmakers voted to oust the entire TSU board after back-to-back audits and years of financial scrutiny. Longtime TSU President Glenda Glover also resigned in June, a move she said lawmakers encouraged. In July, the new TSU board appointed Ronald A. Johnson as interim president, but he resigned in December, citing differences with the board on how best to lead the university forward. The board then appointed Tucker to the role. Questions have swirled over former TSU President Glover's continuing ties to the university after interim President Johnson and his team revealed evidence of years of financial mismanagement and wildly fluctuating budget deficits. Records obtained by the Tennessean showed that the previous board made a $1.7 million four-year agreement with Glover, which included a payout and an ongoing paid advisory role. It's not clear if Glover is still being paid or if her contract is still active. TSU Board Chair DeKasha Winton said Glover's contract is the subject of legal review and referred questions to the Tennessee Attorney General's office, which declined to comment on the matter. Amid pressure from state officials to sell property, make more staff cuts, and even declare financial exigency, Tucker said he was committed to stabilizing TSU's finances. He also told state lawmakers that he was personally committed to cutting all ties between TSU and Glover. Meanwhile, advocates have continued to press for the restoration of $2.1 billion in underfunding to TSU by the state of Tennessee, which happened over the course of 30 years. Which is to say, the university's dire financial straits may not have stemmed merely from the past year of major leadership upheavals. The federal government revealed that $2.1 billion figure in 2023 and recently sent a letter to Tennessee Governor Bill Lee, urging him to take action to address the matter. In October, the university cut back on road games for the band as the school underwent layoffs and a freeze on hiring and non-essential spending. Okay, a tiny editorial note from me. I'm just over here trying to work out just how much sketchiness is at work here. Maybe I'm just a little hypersensitive to issues of education funding as it intersects with politics and corruption and such. Maybe I was too well trained by the extreme sketchiness of the West Virginia University band practice facility building process, upon which I reported here back in the spring. But I first saw the headline of this article and thought, oh boy, another ensemble director put on leave. I wonder what misbehavior brought this on. Turns out, there may be plenty of side-eye to go around, and not only in the direction of the band hall at TSU. So let this be a lesson to everyone. Don't just read the headline. It's a good philosophy for life in these United States anyway at the moment, since there are headline writers who seem to have a bit more of an agenda than just accurate journalism. It would just be interesting to me to know whether the removal of the TSU band director would have happened had all this other scrutiny of the university's financial mismanagement not been happening. As always, I'm not prepared to believe that everything is a suspicious plot. There is such a thing as unfortunate coincidence. But I always keep in the back of my mind the reality that a university band can be a very convenient place to lay blame or to begin the process of death by 1,000 financial cuts, not only to a band, but to an entire university. After all, in this case, the current leadership in the state of Tennessee has a spotty track record on education to begin with, and there are people who would like nothing better than to see as much damage inflicted on public education as possible. And, dear listener, you know my opinion about that little subject. That's news and notes and editorials from the band world for this week. If you have a news item you think should be included in this segment, send me a link via email to heybandwagon@yahoo.com. After this quick break, I have, as I mentioned before, a wee confession. Hope you'll stay with me. Okay, let's pick it up at the second strain. In this week's second strain, from the beginning of this episode, I've been teasing this wee confession that I'm aiming to make, and this is the moment when I'm going to make it. Now, I'm trying to work out how much of this is born of personal tendencies and assumptions, and how much is born of unfortunate happenstance, and how much is born of just blind bad luck. But I got looking at a list of the people with whom I've recorded conversations for the BandWagon Trio section in the past nearly 10 months, and although I looked at it in anticipation of finding one particular impressive statistic, I ended up discovering another one that I didn't care for so much. In the first 45 trio sections, you've heard from 37 people. 3 two-part interviews and 5 of my long-form commentaries or remembrances for a total of 45. The math works, which for me can be a big deal. But then I dug just a tiny bit deeper, not far below the surface of mere numbers, and started wondering, okay, of these 37 people, how many were this and that? How many band directors? How many were my UMassr friends? DMA friends? How many people I'd never met before the recording sessions? And how many... There are a couple of demographics that early on I had been keeping track of and about which I had been trying to create some equity, and which in the ensuing several months I guess I have not paid so much attention to, and that's eventually going to get me to the point of my wee confession. To get you to the finish line, I'm going to tell you 2 brief stories. Story number 1 is about my first band-related job after I finished my music education master's degree at Boston University. It was with a summer youth band program sponsored by the Boston Police Department. For much of the summer of 1998, Madison Park High School in Roxbury, Massachusetts was the home of the Boston Crosstown Band, which was made up of 35 high school band students from all over the Boston public schools. The kids were great. They had a range of playing abilities, but they were all happy to be doing band during the summer, and the 4 instructors, of whom I was one, had a grand time preparing them for sit-down concerts and for marching them from our buses to whatever outdoor Boston concert venue we were playing at. Of those kids, 2 or 3 were white, 2 were Asian, 3 or 4 were Latino or Hispanic, and the rest were black, African American, Caribbean, lots of those subdivisions. In other words, a solid probably 96% were people of color. Of the 3 instructional staff, and let's throw in the Boston police officer who was detailed to our Monday to Friday 9 a.m. to 3:30 p.m. rehearsal days, of all the supervising adults, exactly 20% of them were people of color. 3 of the 4 instructors drove in to what at one time was called the inner city from their cozy little suburban homes, and then at day's end drove right back out again. And for a while, I would tell this crosstown band story to my very, very suburban high school music students, once I nailed down that coveted full-time teaching gig, and I would make the moral of the story, wow, I discovered what it was like to be a minority. I wasn't really, though. I was a statistical minority. I did not live the life of a member of a minority community. I was a suburban white male and had been for all my life. Growing up, my family could afford to buy me a decent instrument, could afford to get me set up with instrument lessons outside school. I lived in a comfortable and quiet house, in a comfortable and quiet neighborhood in which to practice, where I wouldn't disturb anyone who would then yell, "Would you shut up with that racket?" My house did not have noise restrictions. I don't even think my neighborhood had yelling. During the early COVID pandemic, I sat out on the back deck of my house a lot. And yep, I live in a house that has a back deck upon which I can sit, and not everyone has either of those or both. Sitting out there one June evening, I was doing lots more reading and lots more pondering than I'd had the time to do before COVID, because, as you may recall, nobody was going anywhere in the late spring and summer of 2020, so there was plenty of opportunity for gazing, either at one's own navel or at the larger world. The gazing at the larger world, for me at least, was partly driven by the fantasy of one day being able to get back out in it, but also partly driven by events. One event in particular at that moment was the killing of George Floyd. The thinking that I began to do in the wake of that, and of the protests of that, and of the responses to those protests, and in the wake of the killings of how many other people of color in the years prior by people whose job was actually to protect and to serve, that thinking led me to do more reading and to the very belated partial but sufficient understandings of how hard it can be for people of color to buy houses, get access to decent health care, pretty much do anything that pale people like me utterly take for granted. Or at least we don't run into as many roadblocks. Institutional, established roadblocks. Evidence of a system that for how many years has this country been in business? For centuries, seems to have been designed to make life and the living of it harder for people of color. And that's not to even mention the policies that may be put in place in the coming months and years in this country. So I sat on my privileged deck behind my privileged house, thinking privileged thoughts about how my privilege has been so baked into my experience as a white American citizen that, as much as I thought I had been aware of my privilege, I had so much further to go, so much more understanding to acquire. Well, it's at least good to know where you are, so you can try to figure out how to get to where you need to be. Which brings me to story number 2. Some years ago, I had a conversation with an acquaintance of mine. Doesn't matter who or where or in what context, apart from we were both musicians. My friend had just been introduced to the world of competitive drum and bugle corps, and his socks had been rightly knocked off. The level of playing, of moving, of throwing objects and catching, had left him shaking his head in wonderment. And during this conversation I said, well, the thing about those groups is nobody gets in on them without being really good at their jobs to start with. Even before auditions happen, potential auditioners know how good those groups are. They know how good they themselves have to be just to audition for those groups. So those corps don't have to teach them how to play, how to march, how to dance, how to wave and toss and catch, any of that. So that's a whole step in the process that they can just cut out and go right to how can we make the best sound and best picture humanly possible. They can increase the demand on the performers to ridiculous levels because they don't have to teach left foot on 1 or F sharp is second valve or whatever the most basic thing in modern dance is that I don't know. And then I said something that made sense to me at the time, and which I now cringe at a little bit. I said, all those kids are in those corps on their merits. The people who are in those drum corps are the best players and color guard people in this country. No, they're not. They're the best people out of the ones who can afford private lessons to get that good. They're the best people of the ones who went to schools who were well funded enough to have a quality music education program so that they could learn an instrument. They're the best people of the ones whose parents were able to afford private lessons. And people of color, particularly black people in this country, are not remotely guaranteed any of that. Because American society has never been set up to guarantee that. Ever. When I go to the Massachusetts All-State concerts, and I've been fortunate to do so either because one of my students made it in or one of my close relatives made it in, and in all cases they were lovely and talented people who were also pale and relatively privileged, when I look at the All-State program booklet, I see listed the names of the performers and the school districts from whence they came. and I see far more of the Lexingtons and Belmonts and Westons and Foxboroughs and Amhersts and Longmeadows than I see of the Springfields and Bostons and Holyoakes and Worcesters and Chelseas and Haverhills. And if you, dear listener, are not from Massachusetts, feel free to plug in names of cities and towns near you which are wealthy and not wealthy, in that order, and which therefore in all likelihood are less and more ethnically diverse, in that order. Which brings me back, finally, to the list of trio section guests I've had on the BandWagon podcast. Does that list reflect, in terms of percentages, the overall band participation population? Trust me, in terms of racial statistics, it probably does not. A question I could dig into further very soon would be, for that matter, does that list reflect the overall population of band participants in terms of gender or sexual orientation or economic comfort or, well, name a category in which there are not a significant percentage of people who do not enjoy the privilege that straight white males seem to have enjoyed in this country for many, many, many years. In case you wondered, of the 37 interview guests I've welcomed to this program, there have been 21 white males. The math works out wonderfully to exactly 60%. And I thought to myself, the percentage of the total American population, so very probably the American band-related population, who are white males, is probably not 60%. I went to the U.S. Census Bureau website to find out. As of January 19th, at least, the American population is listed as 58.4% white only, not Latino or Hispanic, and is listed as 50.5% female. And if we can apply those numbers, we're probably looking at the American population being, 28 or 29% white and male? So not 60. It's not exactly a thing to suggest that my interview slate is strictly defined as folks who are able to schedule times to sit down and Zoom a conversation with me, since I have to think of them, track them down, contact them, pursue them, and then set up those scheduled times. It's not self-selecting, and it's not at all random. It's me selecting. And yeah, that's a term now. A tiny part of me wants to say, hey, I've spent 10 months just trying to get this podcast up to speed. Does that mean I haven't had any time at all to get intentional about finding women and people of color, people who aren't white and aren't male and, well, aren't straight, to talk to on the pod? A tiny part of me wants to say, well, historically my beloved alma mater band has been pretty pale. And I have band friends and colleagues from the University of Delaware, Boston University, Holy Cross, and we've already acknowledged a system that precludes a lot of black people from accessing higher education. And those particular schools are a lot of things, but affordable community colleges they are not. So comparatively, they and their bands were and are, again, pretty pale on average. But is that an excuse? So this thumbing through my trio section guest list has suggested to me, as a couple of dear listeners have gently done also in this past year, that it will be worthwhile to recommit myself to that. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk, my wee confession. All right, the self-flagellation is over for the moment. So after a grand pause to reflect, I have a conversation for you that I think you'll like. Hope you'll stick around. Okay, let's modulate and get into the trio section. This week in the trio section, I'm pleased to be joined by a band, orchestra, and chamber ensemble conductor and composer. And normally I wait for some of this biographical information to come out via my opening set of questions, but I'm just going to throw some details out there right away because I have no self-control on this one. This gentleman has studied conducting with such nobodies as Michael Haithcock, Eugene Corcoran, Frank Battisti, H. Robert Reynolds. His compositions have been performed in locations and events including, but not limited to, Interlochen, the WASB International Conference, the Midwest Clinic. 3 of his works for wind ensemble were chosen by the Boozy and Hawks Company for their Windependence series. 3 of his works are included in GIA's Teaching Music Through Performance in Band series. And his research on the wind music of Igor Stravinsky and American Pulitzer Prize-winning composer John Harbison has been published and presented at a number of conducting symposia. So I have everything to ask him about and nothing whatsoever of my own to add to this. Please help me welcome to the program Dr. Robert Spittal. Hello.
Hello, how are you? Pleasure to be here today.
Thankful that you were willing to come and do this. Because I inflict them on everybody with whom I get to talk, no matter their station in life, I will begin with my standard set of opening band biography questions, which begins with, what's your primary instrument?
Well, my primary instrument, that's interesting. I started on flute and then picked up the saxophone pretty quickly after that. So and I have sort of a double life in that regard. Flute, my major instrument, I studied classical flute, played in orchestra, wind ensemble, etc. I was sort of Mr. Piccolo everywhere I went because I loved playing piccolo also. I picked up the saxophone in eighth grade because none of my friends played flute. They were all in the jazz band and play. And I was in a flute section of 22 and I was the only boy in eighth grade.
Mm-hmm.
So I was like, maybe I should play saxophone too. So anyway, I picked up the saxophone and have been playing both ever since. And I still play jazz. I don't call myself a professional jazz player in the sense of playing nationally or anything, but I play locally and enjoy it. Every Thursday night, I play a jazz night downtown Spokane. So,
is there a laundry list of bands that you've been active with in your life from the early days to now, whether it's playing or conducting or whatever?
I've been really privileged to be a part of really great programs, starting with high school. I graduated from Parma High School, which is a suburb of Cleveland. That high school from the 50s into the early 80s was a high profile program, played at Chicago Midwest, had a really great legacy that I kind of came into in the 1970s. And so we actually had a high school wind ensemble where other high schools had bands. So I started with that program and went to Ohio State University. And my main connection there, the reason I went there was because of Craig Kirchhoff, who's a phenomenal conductor, great conductor, one of the greatest conductors I've ever been able to play for. And he got me started with it, got me interested in conducting. And so I got on that path. But I was a music education and performance major at Ohio State. But I played in the wind ensemble and the concert bands there. And the concert band toured to Carnegie Hall my senior year. I tried out for the marching band, which is interesting. You know, the marching band at Ohio State, great band, all brass. I'm a flute saxophone player, but I think I can do this, you know. So I picked up an alto horn, which I could kind of get around a little bit because Ohio State uses British brass band instruments in their marching band. So they don't have, you know, mellophones that you play like the, they have alto horns like the old British bands. You have to audition to get in the band, by the way. They're like 400 who audition for 180 spots or something. But they audition you in marching and playing. Well, I spent all my time learning the alto horn, but they have very rigorous marching requirements.
They sure do.
And my review was great player, which is astounding that they thought I was a great player of alto horn, you know. But they said 2 left feet. That was that was how they judged my marching. So I wasn't able to be in the illustrious Ohio State marching band. So that was one thing I was never able to.
You were on beat 1 all the time.
Right. But then I went from Ohio State to Baylor University, which is in Texas. And that's where Michael Haithcock was then. Michael Haithcock eventually became the director of bands at University of Michigan. But he was a young 32-year-old director of bands in his first year at Baylor. And so I took this plunge to go to Baylor and go to graduate school to study conducting, not knowing anything about Texas, coming out of Ohio. So I drove down and took the job as a grad assistant down there. And I got my marching band experience there. I was basically the assistant director of the marching band at Baylor and played in the wind ensembles and orchestras there. And they're phenomenal and have really, since then, Baylor wind ensembles have really ascended to a high level. And then from there, I went to University of Cincinnati, where I studied with Gene Corporon and played in those ensembles as well. So I got to play in a lot of the premier band programs at the university level in the US. So I've been privileged to do that.
So what's your current band-related role?
After doctoral school, I came to Gonzaga University as director of bands all the way back in 1992. And I've been here since then. So I've had a long period of time here. And that was totally unexpected. I thought coming out of doctoral school, I'd be at Gonzaga for 5 or 6 years and probably move to another
Nice
job.
for a first job, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And what happened was, you know, Gonzaga sort of transformed in that early period of time from a school nobody had ever heard of, a small liberal arts college in Spokane, Washington. But because of the high profile of the basketball team, it happened in the late 90s, right after I came here, the university really transformed into what is now a national university, as opposed to a regional small liberal arts university. We had the benefit in the music program of added revenue and increased students The music program primarily serves non-majors, but we have over 400 to 500 students in ensembles and classes, but only, 30 to 50 undergraduate majors a year. So lots of minors and lots of participation. Gonzaga is kind of like, I think you could compare it to a lot of private liberal arts sort of competitive academic schools. We get students who they could major in music anywhere, but they're going to be lawyers or doctors or engineers. And they play in band, they play in the wind ensemble orchestra for 4 years, athletic band too. That's something else that happened. When I came here, there was no basketball band, if you can believe it, at Gonzaga, a basketball school. So we started the athletic program here as well. So when I came here, there were exactly 15 students in the band program.
Wow.
And that was what the director previous to me tried to do was a community band, and that just didn't really work. So I just started a student ensemble with 15, and we built it up and over the years and expanded the program dramatically. Now we have a fully operational college program. I retired, so to speak, from director of bands position right before COVID. My timing couldn't have really been better, actually. I mean, I was thinking I had done it for, I think, 28 years. We have a very talented music education professor, Peter Hamlin, who taught high school band and orchestra in Florida, got his doctorate from University of Miami. He now does the wind ensemble. I sort of handed it to him. And I'm doing more composition and teaching music theory, and I teach conducting. And I still write music for band. That's kind of where I am with band mainly now. And I go out and conduct my own music quite a bit.
I was going to ask a question that I will now amend. The question was going to be, how much did your conducting studies influence your composing style? But I'm going to add to that, how much of your early experience at Gonzaga was an influence on your writing approach, considering that the vast majority of Gonzaga band students at the time were not music majors?
I think, yeah, it's interesting you brought that up. I think my early struggle, which obviously it is a struggle to grow a program, it was frustrating musically to have a weaker program. I mean, I went from conducting in Cincinnati, these great, ensemble. I get my first job at a university and I have a small group, mostly non-major ensemble. So that motivated me to write more just on its own. It motivated me to be creative that way and express myself through writing. But also, you're right, my working with those kind of players and other experiences. I did leave out that I taught high school band for 2 years, but working with that kind of player, I think I do have a solid understanding of what it's like for them to experience playing their instruments at that level. You know what I mean? And so even though I feel like I'm a quite capable professional musician, I can relate to the community type player well and where they are in their. I think a lot about kinesthetically, the physicality of playing an instrument. Like when I'm writing saxophone, I think about what it feels like to play these, so I think a lot about that from a perspective of I don't want to make it unreasonably overly challenging for no apparent reason for the player. So I try to write very idiomatically for the parts. And I think I learned a lot about that through my experience at Gonzaga. I don't think like if I had gotten a great dream job right out of doctoral school, I may never have published any of my compositions because I would have been so busy with score study and trying to do many, many concerts, at that level. So being at a liberal arts school gave me time to find out who I really am, as a musician. And so that's how it influenced my composition, I think. That whole experience helped make me a composer and a better one for band.
In my role as a community band conductor, every so often, I will not say it during rehearsals, but in my head, I will think it. I don't think this arranger was a flute player. I don't think that she or he knew the technical things to start with. Sometimes there's not evidence that reveals that the composer has spent a lot of time in those sections.
Well, yeah. And, this reminds me of something. Frank Battisti, he said something once, I heard at a session I was at with him. It's no accident that the best pieces of music have the best individual parts for the players. Great music players like to enjoy. They want to enjoy playing great music. And so great composers write great parts. And that's something I've always tried to keep in mind. And not everybody has that philosophy, and that's okay. There is the philosophy of we should always be challenging instrumental technique, pushing the limits, for pushing it that way. And there is something to that. I mean, Stravinsky did that, Beethoven, but that's not me. And the kind of music I want to write for people is different, more accessible, but still hopefully is honest and has integrity and isn't banal and cheesy. Because if you go too far toward audience accessibility, then it becomes lowest common denominator, right? Yeah. So there is that balance there. You want it to be art and my own expression, but still accessible, the language accessible to people, as many people as possible. So that's how I think.
In some sense, creating the opportunity for people to enjoy playing, even if they're consciously aware that, I'm being pushed a little bit.
Yeah, because I don't write easy parts. I'm not trying to say that.
I've heard your music. No.
But no one can say, this is just unreasonably difficult or impossible to play on my instrument. Like right now, I just finished an oboe, a piece for oboe and small wind ensemble. And I'm writing for Jung Choi, who is the new oboe professor at University of North Texas, where Gene Corporon is. And Gene helped commission this piece for oboe. But anyway, thinking about oboe, okay, I'm not an oboist, but I'm a woodwind player. I know what flute and clarinet and saxophone can do. But oboe has some unique challenges. And I don't know exactly and I don't want to write something that I think is very fluid, that's going to put an unnecessary burden on the player. Because I know as a player, because I'm also a performer, right? Mm-hmm. I think that way too. As a player, those can just be annoying and become the focus of what you're doing in that moment instead of the music, right? You're focused on that technical challenge. And it's unnecessary, right? To me, sometimes. And so I sent it to her and are there any unreasonable things here? And of course, the first instinct for that, no, I can play anything, but I'm not you, but let's say
a decent oboist,
one of your undergraduate oboe majors, like that. And so I'm always thinking about that when writing parts.
I attended a band director's clinic in New Hampshire last summer, and Randall Standridge was there. And one of the first questions we asked him was, what are important features of a good band piece, in your opinion? And one of the first answers he gave was, make sure all the instruments have some melodic content to play. Because there are tuba players who go years before they play anything other than womp, womp, womp.
Yeah. Another thing that happens is a lot of doubling. So like when you say tuba players playing nothing but bump, well, you're also talking about baritone sax players and bassoonists, and everybody who plays a bass line, because they're all playing everything at the same time, especially with younger, like junior high level music. And I will say, as a composer myself, and others have said it, it's harder to write music for younger players that meets all those expectations. I know it's difficult, but there is too much cookie cutter kind of arranging.
Sitting in grade 1 and 2 new publication reading sessions for me is at least as much fun as sitting in grade 3, 4, 5 ones, because grade 1 and 2, I don't have to think about it's all quarter notes and half notes. I can think about making music with this.
Yeah, that's an interesting point.
Meanwhile, I went on for a moment about, and I will do so again, about having listened to a lot. I do homework for these sessions, and one of my homeworks was, let's go to YouTube and type in his name and see what comes up. And a rabbit hole later.
Yeah.
There were a number of pieces that I was just listening to and thinking it was engaging stuff. And I had read some of the quotes about your music before going and listening. So maybe I should have done it in the other direction so that I could then go and look and say, oh, well, that makes sense now. But one thing that I did read somewhere is that your music has been described as inventive, clever, brilliantly colorful, and full of musicality. But again, I went to this quote a little bit early on. I'm going to come back to it again. It frequently combines sophisticated art music forms and techniques with a non-patronizing sensitivity toward audience accessibility. And having listened to a bunch of it in the last little while, I can suggest that everybody has their opinion, but my opinion is that those opinions are based on fact. So we're talking about two characteristics of compositions which can sometimes be at odds with each other. The musician's concern for aesthetic sophistication and artistic integrity, and an interest in communicating more openly and directly with a listener. So Apart from your early time at Gonzaga, were there any other experiences that pointed you toward the focus on audience accessibility as a composer goal?
Yeah, it really goes way back to when first influence would probably be when I was in high school playing saxophone in jazz groups. I actually played, I was good enough to get in groups outside high school, some professional jazz groups with players who were much older than me and much more adult in many ways than I was. So it was a real life learning experience in many ways. But anyway, playing those kind of gigs, and when you play on a stage in a club, that's a whole other experience than a concert hall, right? And you're still making art, but you're still trying to reach the audience in a way that is connecting a community. It's a more communal thing with the audience. Art music, you have the people on the stage and the audience out here. There's that fourth wall that, right? And so there's more, it's art music. You're not going to move to it, or, you're not supposed to, so to speak. And I've always, throughout my life, since high school, played in bands out in the public, blues, rhythm and blues, jazz, other things. So I've always had that kind of audience understanding and appreciate it. I want the audience to, like my solo.
To like your stuff, yeah.
I want, and I get an immediate response, negative or positive. I've been in some situations where the people in the audience don't even want a band in the room. Depending on the club. And so, so I understand that. And so audience, and a lot of it is simply audience accessibility, reaching that audience and connecting with them musically. And so I guess making that connection is important to me in the art world as well, in the music I'm creating. Now, it doesn't mean when I conduct or when I was programming concerts, I only did music that the audience would like. Yeah. I did, that's
it's worthwhile to stretch them too a little. Yes.
Right. And it's not like in my writing, I don't stretch musically, but I just don't stretch musically in ways other new music, world music often does. Part of that is I'm very educated in conducting and playing. I'm much less educated in how to write music, meaning I've never studied composition, but I've always known composers, and I show them, like Harbison, right? John Harbison, Pulitzer Prize winning composer. When I was working with him on my dissertation, I took him my music because I'd been writing music my whole life and I had pieces back then. And so I showed, and he's, apparently studying composition is they look at it and, oh, this, and they give you some feedback and there you go. But I learned to compose by studying scores and conducting music. That's how I learned how to compose, was by studying other people's music. And that's how composers did it 100 years ago, before academia. I'm not criticizing academia, but the academic perspective on composition is a different one than someone who's not from that. Also, we live in a time where we're postmodern now. When I was in school in the 70s, academic world was still very much in the atonal, highly technical, who cares if you listen kind of mentality.
Not going to go away humming it. We don't care.
Yeah, that kind of thing. That really shifted. Like when I was in doctoral school, I started to see, composition majors who were just interested in minimalism, tonality, triads again, And now, as Eric Whitacre, famous, composer in choral world, has said, anything goes, right? I mean, I write very tonal music for the most part. To me, it's just another scale. It doesn't mean it's not creative or modern or whatever, it's just another scale to work with. Actually, my music's quite modal, so I shift between modes quite a bit, but it's still very tonal. That if I was trying to do this 40 years ago, it would be rejected by academia. No, but it probably wouldn't get played at universities, or it would be seen as banal, or
it's too athletic band.
Kind of, well, in a way, and so, well, yeah, it would be more, they would think of it more in that category. But now that's just not the case. We have band music as Omar Thomas, with gospel and jazz, everything, anything can happen in a band piece these days. And that's a good thing. So I think, what I do is okay. It's not banal at all. It's challenging in other ways, expressively.
The first piece of yours that I took a listen to was your relatively recently completed Concerto for Wind Ensemble. The first chunk of not having a score or program notes in front of me, I was listening and thinking, okay, so how many movements are there? The first movement is a symphonic form, boom.
Yeah, fanfare at the beginning is what it is. Yeah.
Get it right out there. It reminded me of exciting band composers that I'd heard. The next movement, I sat and listened, and it was a totally different thing. And the only way I could describe it was, what if P.D.Q. Bach had been a serious composer? It struck me as being right on the edge of humorous without necessarily being over the top humorous. But those two opening things not only caused me to keep listening, not that I wouldn't have anyway, but I just thought, I wonder what's coming next. And I had read the bit about audience accessibility and thought, well, I can see where he's walking that tightrope.
Yeah.
So compliment for you.
Yeah, I understand. Yeah, there's always, try to always have something to hang on for the audience to hang their hat on. That's a quote that I heard. Maybe it was Morton Gould who said it. I went to this concert in Cleveland where these giants of contemporary music at the time were doing this concert. Morton Gould, I think, was the one who got up and, what did he say? You always want to have in every piece something the audience can hang their hat on, meaning, something you can hang your ear on and follow. And I think a lot of, in my music, that's theme and melodic. So you're following that, yeah. So I try to make it that accessible, thematic material.
Similar to that, a quote that I once heard, which I hope it's truly from Kenny Rogers, is that he said, as long as I give the audience their favorites, I can do anything else that I want for me.
Well, there you go. Yeah. And there's a certain element of truth there too. Yeah. But yeah, in that piece, the opening is just this sort of audacious fanfare like thing that ideas rapidly moving around. It's sort of I grew up in a family of 8 kids. I'm the youngest of 8. And so, when you have conversations in that kind of situation, you're stepping over each other a lot, trying to get your word in. And so the beginning of that piece is kind of like that, a lot of different ideas. And a lot of my music is very interactive. The lines interact. There's a certain approach to counterpoint in my music a lot. But also you mentioned humor. Yeah, in that piece and several others, Scared So Cat and Mouse is another one where, it's intentionally humorous. I like to think I have a sense of humor. I think it's not an offensive sense of humor. And I think and I try to bring that into what I write. It makes it more enjoyable for me. I mentioned, interesting, you mentioned P.D.Q. Bach. I totally relate to that, and I love P.D.Q. Bach, by the way. I've been a fan since my youth. But also Frank Zappa, there's a humorous element to a lot of his music. And I'm attracted to that. I can't help it. It's kind of in my personality. I don't want it to be the prevailing thing. Like when you listen to the piece, you don't think of it as a joke, like you're saying. Right. It's like, this isn't a joke. This isn't P.D.Q. Bach, but I get it. And I think that's where it's saying it's kind of clever and witty, because I've heard that before. People talk about my music. I think that's what I'm trying to do. And I think there's a lot of that in that concerto, actually. But also, what I also try to do is balance that with a lot of my more serious music is heavily serious. Like Pacem, the Hymn for Peace, is there's nothing humorous about that at all. And in the interlude that happens before the third movement of the concerto, it's interesting because I wrote, since you've listened to the piece, it's 3 movements, and the last movement has that slow interlude right before it happens. I originally wrote those 3 movements, just fast, 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 all the fast music. And it was just too much. Yes, it needed that serious relief in that chorale section. And I think that
reverse leavening.
Exactly. And so maybe I can't find the middle. I don't know. A lot of my music is like in the oboe concerto. It's very similar. The oboe concerto, it's for chamber. And as you mentioned, I write a lot of chamber music. And, most people think of band as American 20th century band. You think it all started with Sousa, maybe if you know Patrick Gilmore back in the Civil War. But we've had bands for a long time of various sorts. And so the band that I modeled a lot of chamber music after is the European harmony music band of the 18th and 19th centuries, which is, an orchestral wind section kind of thing. But in this oboe piece, I got three movements. It's basically a concerto, but I call it partita just because I wanted it to sound like a party. Kind of festive, because a lot of harmony music was written for outdoor festive parties, so that's the idea here. But I have the first movement, light and humorous, in a kind of neoclassical way. Last movement is sort of a festive dance, sort of like the last movement of Consort, which is another popular chamber piece I've written, but a dance movement at the end. Middle movement, very serious and heavy kind of reverie, in memoriam kind of movement. So I do try to balance humor with more weighted, more gravity in the music. And it's hard to find the middle ground, I think, for me sometimes. And I'm not even sure what the middle ground is, but what you said about my music is very correct, I think.
I wonder, particularly having read the names of the people that you study conducting with, good Lord, were there any experiences that you had studying conducting with those folks that had an influence or an impact on your composition philosophy or your decisions to program certain things?
There's no question. The people I studied with the most were Craig Kirchhoff, Michael Haithcock, and Gene Corporon. All of those people at the top of the field, they know what good, healthy band composition is. They know what at all levels, and not we think of Bob Reynolds, Mike Haithcock, University of Michigan, Frank Battisti. Yeah, they're conducting Schwantner and these really challenging contemporary works, but they also know the high school repertoire. I mean, Frank Battisti taught high school for 20 years before he went to NEC. But so they know quality repertoire. They were always performing quality repertoire. So I grew up playing the best music, and I couldn't help but learn what the best music is and what it should be. So that definitely shaped my compositional life. And then studying scores and conducting them, everything from whole suite in E flat to Stravinsky symphonies of wind instruments and Schwantner and all this Harbison complicated music and everything in between. Studying those scores was how I learned how to compose. I was fortunate to be studying with these conductors who really knew the best repertoire and knew what that was and why it was good. And that completely shaped my approach to composition and conducting, of course. But yeah, and also when I write music, I think about what it's like to conduct it. And so it's very visceral for me. And I think about I think music that doesn't have flow and motion is not attractive to me at all.
A physical component.
Physical component. Yeah. A lot of my music is dances, rhythmically dancing, So there's always a feeling of movement. And I think that's something people like about slow music that I write, like Pacem, is even though it's slow and it has shape and it has motion and movement, always moving forward in some sense. All these ideas just come from my musical experiences as a player and conductor. The first conductors were composers. John Philip Sousa was a composer and band leader. What instrument did John Philip Sousa play? I don't know. I'm not sure.
I was afraid that was a quiz.
No, I'm like, I don't know. I mean, I have a PhD or a DMA, but in band conducting, I should know what instrument. But it's not that important because but he was a composer conductor. So was Patrick Gilmore. So was Wagner. So was because they wrote music that had to be conducted. And nobody else could do it, so they did it. But now we become very specialized in the 20th century, which I think really, I think that serves institutions more than it serves art, frankly, because that really began in the 1960s. We didn't really have composition degrees. We just had music degrees, right? But then the specialization and came along, and so now we're very siloed in academia, I think, and the institution of academia encourages that. Now we have composers who maybe never play and haven't played an instrument and never mastered an instrument. Now we have conductors who become conductors and maybe never mastered an instrument, that kind of thing.
And when a composer hasn't ever done it him or herself, you know it.
There have been people who've been very successful at doing it, but they're the exception. And I don't know that it's necessarily good for the art. And it's just my own personal view. I like to be a generalist. I like doing a lot of different things in music, not being pigeonholed, siloed into my little world of composing or little world of conducting.
I wonder because I have only dipped my toe into the composing pond, so I don't have a whole lot of experience with this. But there have been the occasional moments when my church choir has nailed something that I have written and made it probably better than it was when it came out of the computer voices, and definitely better than it was even maybe inside my own head. I wonder if you've got a favorite experience with the composition of yours being performed, whether you're conducting it or not.
One that is particularly memorable was Robert Ambrose, who is
Mm-hmm.
director of bands at Georgia State and also conducts the Atlanta Chamber Winds and also the National Chamber Winds. The National Chamber Winds is a wind ensemble in DC that's made up of, well, many of them are retired military band musicians. So they're all professional players of some kind, and some of them play in professional groups in the area. There's a conducting workshop at Midwest, the H. Robert Reynolds Institute. And it's a really awesome session with all these young conductors who come in and they get critiqued by Reynolds and some other, I guess, Jerry Junkin, Mike Haycock, and others have been involved in it. And anyway, Robert Ambrose was able to bring the DC Chamber Winds to Midwest as the lab ensemble for that conducting workshop. And then they performed at Midwest the pieces they did on the symposium. And then Robert added my piece, Consort, to that. To have that piece on a program at Midwest with all these great conductors in the room and to have it acknowledged as a great piece. And they performed the hell out of it as well, because they're professional players, military players. I mean, they can play anything. Plus, they had been playing about 6 hours a day for 2 days straight. So their chops are working. And they just nailed the performance. And that was really thrilling. I've also had my music played at other conferences and at Carnegie Hall and New England Conservatory. Conducting the premiere of my Concerto for Wind Ensemble was amazing as well. So I've been really lucky, and I have had some really amazing experiences with my own music. So yeah, it's lucky.
Yeah, so that question is one that conceivably I could put into my group of questions to wrap an interview up, except that you're the first band composer that I have had on here, so that nobody else would probably have an answer to that question.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
But the rest of the questions start out with, and I'm desperate to know the answers to these, what's one of your favorite pieces of band music that you've played?
One that comes to mind that you may not know, not a lot of people know, but should. It's called Dionysiacs, which is a long word, by a French composer named Florent Schmitt. And this is an old piece from the early, well, actually, it's like the time of Stravinsky in Paris at the time. But it's this really wild band piece. It'll remind you of film music. It's very dramatic and big orchestration. I think he wrote it originally for a band of 100 or something, just a big outdoor band. But I did it at Ohio State and did it again at Cincinnati with Gene. And that's a fun piece to play. But of course, as a piccoloist, I also love playing Sousa marches. So,
There you go.
And also Lincolnshire Posy is a piece I'm very close to, partly because of piccolo, partly because I learned so much about it from Craig Kirchhoff. It has great piccolo parts. So, and I played it many times for him. So I really enjoy that piece too.
So looking in the complete opposite direction, is there a piece of band music that you have never played but you would like to? Or conducted, I suppose.
We'll conduct maybe Maslanka Symphony No. 4 is a great, more contemporary piece that a lot of people love. It's a very accessible, really enjoyable modern symphony for band. But another piece, if you don't mind me mentioning another one,
Yeah.
the Gould that people should know about. It's a great piece as well. Morton Gould wrote a piece for the West Point Band. I think you might have caught, Symphony West Point is the name of the piece. Anyone who loves band will love this piece, because Morton Gould, probably the piece most people know from Morton Gould is American Salute that he wrote during World War II. And it was Morton Gould, very American sounding composer, and someone whose approach to composition I kind of emulate, I guess, in a certain way, which I never really thought of before. It's very accessible and remarkably well done.
Is there a band that you would love to perform with that you never have, either because you're not the right age or you don't live in the right time in history?
Oh, anytime. Wow. Well, it certainly would be cool to play piccolo for the Sousa band. Anytime. But what got me started on flute was I went in Parma, I mentioned my high school. Parma High School, the Cleveland Orchestra used to play West Side concerts at my high school. That's how good an auditorium we had. They wouldn't play it anywhere unless it was a quality hall. And anyway, the U.S. Marine Band, they back then, they would tour the country, tour our part of the country every other year. And they always came to Parma High School. Our school district would have them play a concert in a hall full of fifth graders for obvious reasons, right? Recruiting, get these kids. Yeah. And so, I saw these, and it was an all male at the time. They hadn't, and so, the piccoloists stood up, and they were, Marines, and I thought, wow, that's really cool, and I thought, I want to do that because I want to, play the solo on Stars and Stripes. That'd be pretty cool in a uniform, and that's why I picked up the flute. So yeah, I think I would love to play in the Marine Band, play little piccolo in there. That would be fun.
And the last question I asked, I wonder if that story you just told was a candidate for the answer for this, but do you have a favorite band story you want to tell?
When I was an undergrad at Ohio State, again, with Craig Kirchhoff, we had Fred Fennell come in and guest conductor. He had Fred Fennell come in and guest conduct. And now Craig Kirchhoff, and anybody who knows his conducting knows that, he's masterful technically. I mean, he's just one of the clearest conductors you'll ever play. Well, Fennell is not that, but we were all undergrads, right? And if you know Fennell's conducting, he's not Mr. Clarity. He's nope. Mr. Music and dancing on the podium and all. Well, we knew who Fred Fennell was from recordings. I mean, we had never worked with him before. We were 20 years old. There's no video online back then of these conductors. We just knew Fred Fennell from the inside of our music folders. His,
yes,
which are really great tips. They're really good. They should have those listed in every music education course, But we know him in the picture in his hippie smock, inside. Remember?
Yes.
But anyway, that's what we knew of Fred Fennell, and that he was the great conductor of the Eastman Wind Ensemble. Well, he did Lincolnshire Posy with us. He comes in, we're all ready to play for him, and he gets up there. He doesn't give a downbeat. He just jumps up and starts dancing. We try to start playing. The band just sort of dissipated and fell apart, and he didn't. He just kept going, and he goes, no, you're supposed to keep playing. And so that was our strategy. Oh, okay, we just don't stop no matter what he does. Okay. Because if we couldn't follow, if Kirchhoff, we followed. I mean, he was just so clear.
Yeah.
But it was just really amusing. But then after we got the hang of it and understood his approach to conducting, it was just a fabulous concert. We all came around, but that was a very memorable experience, and it taught me a lot about conducting. That people do it all kinds of ways, but a lot of it is just inspiration, and that's what he had. He had musicality and inspiration, not a lot of clarity, but he made it. So that was a memory. Anytime you work with Fred Fennell, it's going to be memorable.
Well, I am grateful for your willingness to join me today and have this conversation. At the end of every podcast, they tend to ask, are there good places online for people to follow what you're up to if they'd like?
Yeah, definitely. I have my own website, and having an unusual name is an advantage in the digital age. It's just my name.com. So it's www.robertspittal, and that's one word, ROBERTSPITTAL.com. And you'll find all my pieces, the ones that are available, and recordings and some sample scores and such there.
Anyway, composer, conductor, musical man of the people, Bob Spittal, thank you for your time. It was a genuine pleasure getting to meet you and having this conversation.
Thanks, Rob. Real pleasure for me as well. Thank you.
Okay, we'll take a break and then a couple of quick thoughts to close out this week's episode. And I mean quick, I promise. Do stick around, I implore you. Here comes the dogfight. This week's dogfight is a brief tale of one of my experiences with the Massachusetts Music Educators Association, specifically its Senior District Festival. This was about 10 years ago, and I was acting as one of my school's chaperones, traveling via school bus with the various district band and chorus students from that town to the rehearsal site, staying there while they rehearsed, and then traveling back to our school afterward. So, an afternoon shot to pieces. Actually, no, it was great to see the kids involved in festival ensembles, where you can get a musical experience that maybe we couldn't provide them ourselves back home. There was a hospitality room for chaperones, and I availed myself of it. Bagels are never a bad thing. And I traded stories with the other chaperones about our respective teaching hitches, and silently made note of the fact that maybe my situation wasn't nearly as dire as some of theirs. After a while, I got up to stretch my legs and decided to extend that activity to a full-fledged stroll, maybe even to go eavesdrop on one of the ensemble rehearsals. And as I made my way down one corridor in this fairly standard-looking high school building, I heard a really interesting sound. I paused and listened intently and thought maybe I was hearing a groundbreaking new band composition with lots of heavy-duty brass interacting with a bit of world percussion and a whole lot of world music-y vocal parts. Sounded like the kind of a piece they would do at senior districts or Allstate. I wondered if the composer was anyone I knew or knew of, or anyone whom I would have suspected of writing a piece like this. And then the concert band in the rehearsal space off that corridor stopped playing, and I realized that their sound was momentarily yielding completely to the sound of the basketball cheerleaders, which was coming from the gym further down the corridor. Oh well. After this pause, which does not contain rah-rah sis-boom-bah, we'll wrap things up for this week. Thanks for continuing to listen. To wrap up this week, let's take the CODA. For the CODA this week, a brief note following last week's little first strain rant about the imminent content moderation changes over on Facebook and the rest of the Meta social media platforms. Again, I'm staying on Facebook mainly because, again, my little Facebook silo seems relatively free of extremist nastiness, although I gotta say, having to do multiple mouse clicks just to make my news feed full of only posts from my actual Facebook friends is a pain in the tuchus. Otherwise, thanks to the Zuckerberg crew pushing content onto my feed whether I ask for it or not, it's 5 ads for every friend post, and that's getting real old real fast. Either way, this podcast is now represented on BlueSky now as well. As an alternative to Twitter, certainly for all the same reasons, but also because I'm seeing various of my Facebook friends heading over to BlueSky, and maybe that's the platform of the future? Even if not, it makes a certain amount of marketing sense to have a presence on as many internet places as makes sense, and maybe BlueSky will make more sense as we go? It's fun to find out. That's BandWagon for this week. Thanks as always for downloading and listening. BandWagon was written, researched, and produced by your humble host. Musical interludes were produced by Hamilton Media from source material largely by John Philip Sousa. You can listen to more episodes at the pod's website, heyband.podbean.com. Please give me feedback. Let me know what you like or what you think might change. You can do that using the email address heybandwagon@yahoo.com, or leave a 90-second voice message by going to speakpipe.com/heybandwagon. Be aware that I do reserve the right to include your message on the podcast unless you say otherwise. Those contact links and links to this week's news items, conversation topics, and my interview guest, Bob SPITTAL, can be found in our show notes, as can a link to BandWagon's merch store thanks to the good folks at TeePublic. Please share the show on social media, and thank you for that. If you enjoy this podcast, please do share it in the direction of someone whom you think might not be a listener just yet. Word of mouth really is the best recruiting tool. And to keep up with the pod every week, subscribe to BandWagon on the Podbean app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever fine podcasts are sold. For now, take care, stay in touch, stay in tune, and we'll do this all again next week. I'm Rob Hammerton. Detail, parade, rest. Never assume anything.